Hey everybody, this is Britton here with Blue Manor Academy, and today I wanted to talk about finding and teaching truth in a world of bias. So in Revealing School, I have a chapter. I didn't actually know how true this was at the time, but I have a chapter in there talking about socialist fables, how the schools teach all these socialist fables. I didn't even know it. I just stumbled on it a few times randomly, and I thought, wait a second, like I believed that my whole life. I thought people who didn't believe it were just ignorant or biased or horrible people or whatever. But then you study history and you're like, wow, like they lied to us in the school system. And when we are putting together Blue Manor Academy, that's something we have to constantly do. We have to look through our sources. We have to fact check things. And I want to help you guys do that yourself. There are obviously things, classics and stuff like that we have on Blue Manor Academy that still have some sort of bias or agenda. I don't think that's an issue as long as you know what to look for and you're able to help your kids kind of determine what is biased, what is true, what is false, what's opinion. Because everywhere they go in life, people are going to be biased. Everybody's biased. Everybody has an agenda. I'm biased. I'm a fairly conservative Christian. Mostly, I just like to call myself a Christian. That is my worldview, and that's where my bias comes from. So it's important to know those things. When I wrote Revealing School, I didn't know how true the socialist fables were. I knew that the Civil War, that was probably the biggest shock for me. Lincoln was always my favorite president. I always believed the Civil War was about slavery. And when I went to prep school, they challenged that. We're telling this crazy narrative, and I remember thinking, like, you guys are so wrong. And, I was a total Yankee, and this prep school was in Virginia. So I just assumed that these guys are biased. It's their history. They're perpetuating a false history. Fast forward, 15 years later, I start studying some of this stuff, and I'm like, wow, there's no defense for it. There were slave states who fought with the North. I think there were 5 of them. They were slave states before, during, and after the war. Actually, the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln issued, he exempted them. He said they didn't have to free their slaves. And when people, the abolitionists, a lot of Christian abolitionists were like, what are you doing, Lincoln? Why are you exempting them? He's like, well, if they think the war's about ending slavery, they'll join the South. So I wish the war was about ending slavery. I talk about that in my book, but it's important to understand that there's a lot of false narratives that we get taught, and it affects our worldview, and that's why that they do it. And so we need to be able to identify them. We live in a world of fake news. I remember watching the news one time, and this was a liberal news outlet, and it was kind of like, I don't want to get too into it, but basically they claimed that this girl was calling for peace. There was a whole bunch of riots. And they zoomed on this girl, and they said that she was calling for peace. And they showed a little clip of her calling for peace, and she says, don't burn this stuff down. We need it. Like calm down. And it looked like really good. Like, wow, that was really mature of her. She is calling for peace. Well, thanks to cell phones, we don't have to rely on the news so much anymore. Other people were filming it, and the truth got out. And the truth was, she said, don't burn our stuff down. We need it. Go into their neighborhoods. Go into the suburbs. Burn their crap down. And you're like, wait a second, that's a totally different narrative. She wasn't calling for peace. She was calling for violence. She was just redirecting the violence at people outside of her own community. So you think, man, the news is so fake sometimes. How can our kids know what's true? Where do they go to fact check things? So we're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. There's also fake entertainment. Most of us grew up with Disney. Disney is so bad. Disney was taken over in the 1984. That'll be in my final book, Revealing Disney. It's a really tragic story. It's why Blue Manor Academy will never go public. We're so far from that. I mean, but if we got huge, we'd never go public. We'll always be private. We'll probably never be an absolute. We might be a nonprofit in practice, but we will never be a nonprofit. Because of how companies get hijacked. And the story of Disney really impacted me. I grew up wanting to be a Disney illustrator. I am an illustrator today. I've written children's books illustrated like Dino Hunt. Hopefully some of you guys have seen that. It's pretty cool. But I always wanted to work for Disney. Disney was like my hero growing up. Disney, it's the most tragic story. They were taken over in 1984. Disney fought these people. And they played some dirty tricks, and it's really sad. And now Disney, I would say, that company is in the enemy's hands, and they produce a lot of fake entertainment. So it's things that we think, oh, they're just trying to entertain us, but actually they have a political agenda attached to their shows, and they have false narratives, and they offer false history. One of those would be Pocahontas. So I think we're all familiar with the story of Pocahontas. One, Pocahontas was a little girl. She wasn't a grown woman. There wasn't a love connection between John Smith and Pocahontas. It would have been weird. They think Pocahontas was probably 10 to 12 years old. John Smith was much older when she saved him. it was also had a Christian narrative because she becomes a Christian. She actually goes back to Europe, and she actually helps create a peace compact between the Indians and the colonists. But Disney wanted to make it about race, that there was this racial distrust. And I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. They're trying to break down this racial racism, but that wasn't the narrative of the story. They were not racist. They didn't hate each other. John Smith was, I guess, trespassing on enemy land, and he got taken captive, and they were going to execute him because the settlers were encroaching on their land. But I don't necessarily think it was a racial issue. The white Europeans didn't necessarily hate the Indians, and I don't think that the Indians necessarily hated the white people because of their skin. There might have been some of that, but that wasn't the original narrative of the story. They made it all about race because of the civil rights movement. And that's fine that they want to promote the civil rights movement, but that wasn't the narrative of Pocahontas. And they got all the facts wrong, and they made her into this mystic talking to trees and stuff like that. But actually, she became a Christian. And at any rate, that's not a big one. The other one, Anastasia, that one kills me, the story of Anastasia. Kids will watch that and they're going to think Rasputin's this evil Satanist. And, most of that comes from propaganda, from people who hated Rasputin, who killed Rasputin, who ended up butchering the Tsar and his family. The people who ended up murdering little Anastasia, those are the people who painted that satanic narrative for Rasputin. And so your kids are going to watch that and they're going to have a wrong idea of the history. Rasputin was not the enemy. He was not the bad guy who fomented that revolution using demonic powers. I think there were probably demonic powers at work, but it certainly wasn't coming from Rasputin. He was a victim of the revolution, as was the whole Tsar's family. So that, again, that's fake entertainment. Our kids are going to watch that and they're going to get a false worldview. The Russian Revolution was a travesty. They were very, very, very evil men who fomented that revolution. So that's something to be aware of. Fake news, fake entertainment. When I say fake entertainment, I just mean entertainment that has a political agenda. You think you're sitting down to be entertained, or your kids are just going to enjoy this. It's a fun, silly show. But actually, it's a form of indoctrination. They have an agenda. You might agree with their agenda, but understand that there is an agenda, and a lot of times they're tweaking and manipulating the facts to present that agenda. So we're really careful. I don't necessarily avoid all the Disney shows. My kids, I don't care if they watch Pocahontas, but it's really important that I sit down beside them and say, hey, listen, these people have an agenda, and let's go read the actual history, and then let me just show you how much they twisted that. And I actually think it's dishonest. I hate when they take real history and turn it into a fictitious narrative, because they can do entertainment in many ways. They can write their own scripts. They can make up movies for entertainment and put whatever narrative that they want. But when they go back and rewrite history, they're twisting our kids' understanding of how the world works. And how can our kids learn from history if they're learning a false history? So anyway, that's fake entertainment. Another one, fake history. This is huge. Fake history. We already just talked about it a little bit with Disney, but the History Channel. I used to love history. I still do. But I was a huge history buff. I used to watch the History Channel all the time. And it was really funny because I was so ignorant of history. I kind of had this same narrative that the public schools had taught me. And so I'd watch it and I'd just absorb it and be like, wow, that's incredible. That happened and this happened and whatever. But one day I was watching this show. I think it's called The Men Who Built America. It's about Andrew Carnegie and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and stuff like that. And it was a really fascinating show. But all of a sudden they got to this part, and I knew this history intimately. I had read it a ton. I had actually researched some of it for Revealing School about Andrew Carnegie. So I knew the facts pretty well. And as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, what? Wait a second. They've got it all backwards. It wasn't an accident. It was a blatant lie, a total misrepresentation. What happened was there was a strike at Andrew Carnegie's steel mill. And by the way, I'm no fan of Andrew Carnegie. He was instrumental with the Rockefellers in founding the public education system. They definitely had an agenda. They were definitely bad people. But he had a steel mill, and there was a huge strike there. And what happened is the workers, they took it over. They had guns. They were extremely violent. They wouldn't let any new workers come in. So Andrew Carnegie, he hired the Pinkertons, which was a private police force. And the Pinkertons were showing up to negotiate and kind of, I guess, break the strike. They definitely brought guns. They were ready to do battle, but they got annihilated. They came in on a barge. The barge was surrounded. They actually sent dynamite out. The strikers sent dynamite out to blow up the barge, and that failed. And they were shooting down at the boat and killed a bunch of people. And at the end, the Pinkertons, the police, private police, had to surrender to the strikers, and some of them were beaten almost to death. And then finally, Andrew Carnegie called the governor. He sent in 4,000 National Guard troops to put down the strike. So both sides were doing violence. I mean, that's just the facts. No narrative, just the facts. The way the History Channel presents this, okay, it's a bunch of peaceful strikers who aren't being paid enough, and they just want a little bit better working conditions. So it's very sympathetic of the unions, the leftist unions, and that's okay. But here's what really bugs me. They're standing there peacefully. The Pinkertons come up to the line, and they've been following this boy. It's pure propaganda. They've been following this little boy. He's probably like 16 to 18 years old, and he's working for his family, and you just like him. And he's just standing there causing no trouble. And then the Pinkertons come up and they just pull out their guns and start gunning everybody down. And there's this one scene where the boy who you've become attached to, he's one of the workers, the strikers, he's on the ground and he's reaching up with his hand, if I remember it correctly. And one of the Pinkertons just walks by with his gun and just shoots him down dead. So if you watch that, you think, oh my goodness, like these evil police, these poor strikers are just wanting a better life, when actually it's a lot more complicated than that. They were extremely violent. They got the best of the Pinkertons. I believe they killed some of them. They certainly beat them up, and they were extremely violent. So I'm not pushing a narrative. I'm just telling you the facts of what happened and how the History Channel has their own agenda. They're extremely biased. They have no problem lying, and that's a lie. To present it that way, in my opinion, is just totally a lie. I'll never do that at Blue Manor Academy. I have a Christian bias, but I also have a bias to the truth. If Christians have done some bad things in history, I'm okay letting the kids know it. We are all sinners. I love the Old Testament, the Jewish histories, because you know what David did. You know what he did with Bathsheba. You know his faults. You know King Solomon's faults. He ended up starting off as a great king, becoming actually a really evil, bad king. They were honest. They told honest history, and that's okay. We should be able to do that too. Another example, Martin Luther, the founder of the Reformation. He wasn't actually, but he became the spokesman for it. And, I've tried to talk to people just honestly, and they're like, oh, how could you criticize him? He did great things. I'm not criticizing him. I say what he did. He did some good things. You can agree with his 95 Thesis. He did some great things. He also did some really terrible things. And that's okay. And I'm not even going to say terrible, because that would be my interpretation. He also killed a lot of people who he didn't agree with religiously. And a lot of them were other Protestants. It wasn't just the Catholics. He really went after the other Protestant sects. Not the Arminianists, but the, I hate going live. I always go blank, because I wasn't even going to talk about Luther. But the point is like, you can like Luther, you can love Luther, think he's a great historical character, but we can't lie about him. We have to tell an honest narrative. St. Peter, think about that guy. He's a great guy, but the Bible recorded that he doubted Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. So that's a true history. It's giving the positive. We can still love him and admit the faults. We can still love our country and admit the faults. At the same time, we can't allow leftists to demonize everything and rewrite a false narrative because they hate this country or they hate what it was founded for. Or anyway, so truth matters. All right, I want to get to just one more. I didn't pick any of the controversial ones. I really didn't mean to go into the Civil War. I hate that I even did that, because there's so much more evidence that I need to offer, and most of us have been programmed that if somebody thinks the Civil War was about slavery, then it's obviously because they're hateful people. Well, the truth is, I used to believe the Civil War was about slavery. I shouldn't have brought it up today. Now I feel like I need to finish it. I dressed up as Abraham Lincoln, and it was in the newspaper. My costume was so good in 6th grade. My first book report ever, or not book report, but just report in 3rd grade, was on Lincoln. I love Lincoln. But the truth is if you study history, you go back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he says some pretty terrible things. I'm not even going to say terrible. That's me characterizing it. He says some things that would be considered racist. He actually, in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, says that he understands that blacks and whites can't live together in society, and like all people, he thinks that if they can't live equally, that whites should be superior. He just doesn't know if slavery is the right way to do it. He said that. He didn't emancipate the slaves at the beginning of the war. Everybody thinks that's what initiated the war, was the fight over slavery. He waited 2 years. The war could have been over and done with, and he wouldn't have emancipated the slaves. He emancipated the slaves when he was losing. If you look at his address to Congress, I've gone back and studied because I had questions, because you see these two conflicting sides. I'm like, okay, what are the facts? I go back, I read his address to Congress. The first address he makes after the war begins, he addresses Congress. He doesn't mention slavery. He talks about the importance of preserving the Federation, the Union. He He doesn't mention slavery except he mentions a few slave states, but the topic of slavery doesn't come up, and it's a long speech. So if that was the crux of the war, that would have been in there. And then you go back and look at the secession proclamations made by the states. Almost none of them mention slavery except for one. I never read them all, but one of them says at the end, they say, and after all this other stuff, why we should secede from the Union, after all this other stuff, they say, and if we don't emancipate ourselves, eventually the North will probably try to free all the slaves. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the Southerners didn't want slavery. I'm just saying that that wasn't necessarily the cause of the war initially, and there's tons of evidence. And I only say that because I've studied the facts. That's what the facts are. I wish the Civil War had been fought to free the slaves. And I also think you can say, oh, it's racist not to, like leftists do, or you can say, you know what, it'd be racist too. You're telling a lot of African American people that the whites up north came down and freed them, so you're indebted to them, basically. They risked their lives, they died freeing you to end slavery. I'm sorry, I wish that was the narrative. It's just not true. The truth is, I'm not going to get into it. I won't tell you what caused the Civil War. Slavery certainly was a cause of agitation, but the people working hardest to free the slaves were abolitionists, Christians. Lincoln was not necessarily a Christian. I don't know that he ever attended church or went to church. That would probably shock most people too. But the abolitionist movement was definitely a Christian movement. So you could say Christians worked to free the slaves. You cannot say that the North fought a war to free the slaves. It was all about crushing the secessionists and preserving the Union. And the straw that broke the back and started the secession was over economics. There was a tariff pass that was going to be really heavy on the southern states. That's what they say, and they secede. And even if they seceded over slavery, you couldn't say that was the cause of the war because Lincoln could have just let them secede. But Lincoln said, no, you're not going to secede from the Union. We're attacking you. And yes, the Southerners fired the first shots, but actually it was after the Northerners sent troops down. And why am I getting into it? Well, it's not the time. But I just want you to know that at Blue Manor Academy, we're going to teach true history. It's important because kids can't learn from history if they're learning false narratives. That's it. One last one. I shouldn't have gotten into slavery, but I do want to get into this one. The Revolutionary War, another false narrative. We were taught that a bunch of peasant farmers outsmarted this superpower of an army, Great Britain, and they hid behind bushes and rocks and used guerrilla tactics. And the dumb British with their red uniforms just walked basically into the line of fire and we outwitted them, okay? And I believe that my whole life. And then there's a few things that didn't, they kind of like challenged that paradigm. One of them was I went through Special Forces selection and most of the course before getting a knee injury. And during Special Forces selection, we get this Ranger Handbook. This goes back to the Revolutionary War, the Ranger Handbook. They're still teaching it. It's still fundamental for guerrilla warfare. So Rangers, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, they still carry around the Ranger Handbook. That's still what they're learning tactics from. It's that relevant today, okay? So you think, oh, cool, because of the Revolutionary War, the Americans were using guerrilla tactics, they wrote a manual. Only the manual was written by the British. It was actually a British, I think he was a colonel, major, who wrote the handbook for guerrilla warfare. The British understood guerrilla warfare. It wasn't, in other words, they knew what they were doing. That's a false narrative. That's not what happened. It makes us feel better to think so, but that's just not what happened. Another thing, I was making curriculum for Blue Manor Academy, and I was looking for the surrender of the British to the Americans at the Battle of Yorktown. And that kind of ended the war and then in a peace agreement. But it was really shocking to me because I'm looking at this famous painting of the surrender, and I see George Washington off in the distance. And I see some other guy accepting the British surrender. And it doesn't compute to me. I'm like, wait, why wasn't George Washington accepting it? He's the key player. Like, we fought this revolution. Like, what is going on? I do a little research and I find out the British actually surrendered to the French. Now, why would the British be surrendering to the French if we fought this war? And we won it with our guerrilla tactics. And then you do research and you say, oh, wait a second. I mean, it stinks. I wish a handful of patriots had overthrown the most powerful government in the world. That would have been cool. But it's not what happened. And it is a false narrative. The French actually supplied the Navy. And when the British were coming in with reinforcements to Yorktown, the French cut them off and basically defeated them at the sea. The French provided all of our uniforms. The French provided our cannons, our muskets. They funded us in large part. Ended up bankrupting France. You say, why do you do that? Another false narrative. But I'll tell you that in a minute. But that's the truth. The French played a pivotal role. The British actually surrendered to the French. And this is really important to understand because, as I said last week, the Glorious Revolution is connected to the American Revolution. And 10 years later, after the American Revolution, you're going to go over to France and you're going to have the French Revolution. And guess what? The same players are going to go over to France and overthrow the government of France. Remember, Louis sent us all this money and he helped us fund our revolution. You think we'd be grateful? Well, that's not the case. Louis had very little to do with it. He was against the American Revolution. And it was, it's interesting. It was bankers, it was Freemasons who funded that. They came over to America, they overthrew the government over here, then they went back to France. And then understanding that helps you understand that this is an international, global, world revolutionary movement. And they're going to go on, they're going to overthrow every single government in the world. It's incredible. They're going to overthrow Germany in World War I. They're going to overthrow Russia in World War I. They're going to overthrow all of South America. They are going to end up destroying the Chinese. And it's crazy, and people don't know that narrative, that true history. They don't know it. They think like the French Revolution happened because there were bread shortages, and the American Revolution happened because of a tea tax, and the Glorious Revolution happened because James was Catholic. That's actually probably true. And they think William of Orange is the hero who came over. They don't even understand who funded that. I'm getting off on some tangents, but this is central stuff, guys. It's actually really important. Your kids cannot understand history, and that's what I loved about prep school. They're like, okay, like those are cute narratives that the public schools teach, and everybody kind of learns their social justice history, but you're here, you're grown-ups, we're going to teach you real history. Okay, so how do you do that? If there's fake news and there's fake entertainment and there's fake history, how do you teach your children the truth? How did I discover the truth? These are my tips. One, Blue Manor Academy. Go to Blue Manor Academy. I try to use books our books are biased, okay? They come from a English, Protestant, liberty-minded background. That's not by design. That's just, we're English. A lot of the classics that we have available to us that are great histories written by like Charles Dickens wrote a history. It's amazing history. So there is that bias there, and that's okay. I wish I could get some French histories and Russian histories, but most of them aren't translated into the public domain yet, so I can't get a hold of them. But it's okay as long as you understand, okay, listen, these people who wrote these history books, a lot of the history is true, but they do kind of have a bias. They have a little bit of a narrative. It's going to be a pro-democracy narrative. It's going to be an anti-monarchy narrative. It's going to be a pro-Protestant narrative. And if you're Protestant, you're going to say, that's great. That's what I want. We're Protestant. I always just want the truth. I don't think it helps if we whitewash history. You know, if we like they call Bloody Mary. She was the Catholic queen. She killed a lot less Protestants than Bloody Elizabeth killed. The Great Elizabeth. She killed a lot of Catholics, by the way. But see, we have this false narrative because we have a kind of an anti-Catholic narrative. But the truth is that they both killed a lot of people on both sides. That's true history. That's all I'll teach. You can take it, you can hate it, but I don't want to propagandize kids. I want kids to know the truth. The truth is powerful, and I'm not afraid of it. As a Christian, I'm not afraid to admit if Christians have done some things wrong. I'm also not going to throw them under the bus and say that everything we did was wrong. I'm going to defend the Crusades. You could hate me because you've already got this idea of, oh, we went over there and slaughtered the... Yeah, right. How did the Muslims get Jerusalem? Anyway, but we're going to teach true history. Okay, I hope I don't lose a whole bunch of my new subscribers because this is more controversial. This isn't really what we're about. I just wanted to address it because of what we talked about last week with the Glorious Revolution. And I got an email from someone and they're like, hey, I looked up the Glorious Revolution. It's so crazy. I hadn't heard of this stuff. And then they list off these things. They're like, it's important because of this. I'm thinking, wait a second. Like, where is that source coming from? Because that's not the narrative. That is the social justice narrative. That's not it. That's not what that war was about. That's not what happened during the Glorious Revolution. That's not why that's one of the most pivotal events in history, in modern history. Okay, so how do you do it? Okay, how do you find the truth? One, you question everything. If somebody tells me that this happened on this day, when I write my books, I have to fact check stuff. There's so much fake news out there on the internet. I actually found this crazy story about Disney, and I started like writing about it when I was writing about Disney. And thank God I fact checked it because it was from a site like The Onion. And I'm like, oh, thank God. You have to fact check your stuff. Go to multiple sources. The other thing, you have to understand the difference between opinion. Was King Louis a good or bad king? That's opinion. Was Hitler good or bad? I'm sorry, that's opinion. That's opinion. But what is fact? What did Hitler do? And you teach that. And then you decide if he was good or bad. Nero, this is hard. Nero killed a lot of people. I think he's a horrible monster, Nero. But I'm going to teach the facts. Here's what he did. Here's what he didn't do. Just because Nero killed a lot of Christians doesn't mean every single thing he did was satanic and evil. He did some good things. he did some good things. And it's okay to say that and say he did some good things and he did these horrible things to the Christians. I'm not going to teach false history and pretend that every waking hour of his day he was just sinisterly looking for somebody to torture and stuff, because that would be propaganda. It wouldn't be true. And then when our kids discover really evil people that are evil, they're going to have this impression that the guy is just snarling and not realize that Nero was probably a pleasant person to be around sometimes. And he's probably pretty friendly, but he did some really bad things. And the same goes with Hitler and Stalin and those guys. We don't have to say that everything Hitler did or everything Stalin did was horrible and wrong. And you see those quotes, they'll say, Hitler did this and Trump did it too. Okay, well, if Hitler pet a puppy dog, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pet puppy dogs. Let's just stick to the facts. What did Hitler do that was wrong? What did he do that was right? And just be unbiased. That's the only, otherwise don't study history. Don't study history if you're not willing to accept the true narrative. Okay, so question everything. The other thing you have to do is hear both sides. It's not fair. Imagine if you had a trial or if a police came, you have a dispute with your neighbor and they just come over, talk to the neighbor, and they're like, guilty. And you're like, wait a second, you didn't even hear my side. Well, that's what happened to me. For most of my history, I heard one narrative. With the French Revolution, I'm French. That's my background. I'm American, but I'm kind of come from France. And I had this idea the French Revolution was the peasants' uprising because they didn't have bread, and the evil, arrogant king. And that was the narrative that and Aunt Mary Antoinette, she's this little twerp of a schoolgirl who partied, and when the people were starving, she said, let them eat cake. She was so out of touch. That's all off propaganda posters from the people that cut her head off. Okay, but you go back and you look at her side. What did she say about herself? What did her daughter say about her? It's incredible. It changed Mary Antoinette is one of my heroes now. You read her daughter's diary and you get a totally different perspective. And you could say she's biased too, the daughter, but I've seen both sides. I've seen the fruit of both sides. I've seen their nature. I've looked at the propaganda, which is just horrifically pornographic, just the most filthy, evil things they said about Mary Antoinette. And you say, these weren't godly Christian men. These people were full of satanic hate for her. And then you read her response. You read, I read this story about Mary Antoinette, and totally different narrative. If I could go back and fight in the French Revolution, I'd totally fight on Louis' side. Poor Louis, he was a naive king. I feel sad for him. His situation, what happened to his family, what happened to his son. Man, I would go back and fight. Even knowing I'd lose, I would fight for the king. The French Revolution makes me sick to my stomach. And that's a tangent. I'm off. Okay, but hear both sides. It's important. They have a right to be heard. Anybody can slander anybody. If you only read the Jewish Talmud and you read about Jesus Christ, you would be disgusted. They have him, I believe, in hell, in boiling in excrement. They hate him. And if you read their history and you didn't read the Bible and Jesus' own words and the testimony of his apostles, you get a totally different view. You have to hear both sides. That means studying the American Revolution. What did Parliament say? What did the king say? What did the people? There were a ton of people in America that didn't want the American Revolution. What did they say? That is studying true history. Don't brainwash your kids. That's not education anymore. It's no advantage to them. Study both sides. You can say okay, I've studied both sides, and I think the American Revolution was great, but think. It's okay to think. In our family, I asked a question to the homeschoolers. I'm like, so what's a better form of government, a republic or a monarchy? And it was like the dumbest question. Everybody's like, how could you even ask that? Of course, republic. Okay, think. What are the advantages of monarchy? What are the advantages of a republic? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a democracy? Think. It's okay to think. We don't have to have a narrative rammed down our throat. We have to be free thinkers, not in the leftist sense, but we have to be able to think and process things for ourselves. We can't get stuck into somebody else's narrative. So think, hear both sides. Christopher Columbus is a great example. I can't get into it. My wife says I go on too long and I ramble. Christopher Columbus is a great one. So half the country is like, we love him. He's the greatest. He's saint. He's God himself. Jesus, he's so good. And then the other side is like, he's a devil and he is a rapist and a pedophile and is a slavist. And okay, well, what is the truth? Okay, well, where did that come from? That narrative about him being a monster came from his enemies, people who wanted to get him kicked out. They're writing back to Queen Isabella, and they're like, remove this guy, he's incompetent. And the funny thing, the ironic thing about the whole thing is, they were accusing him of favoring the Indians over the white settlers. Christopher Columbus was coming down really hard on the white settlers because a lot of like criminals and stuff were like, hey, it's a new world. Let's go over there and we'll help settle it. A lot of established people weren't coming over. So Christopher Columbus getting all these really rough people. And he writes back to, well, anyway, so they're accusing him of all these bad things. That's where the negative narrative comes from. What did he say in his defense? If you read his letter, he says in his defense, he's like, look, you don't understand what's going on over here. These natives are really degenerate people. They haven't heard Christianity yet. There are prostitutes coming over. There are children and soliciting the soldiers, and there's cannibals here. And I'm dealing with all of this, and I have my men taking advantage of some of this and prostitution and stuff. So you hear both sides, and after you read Christopher Columbus' side, you say, wait a second, he's not admitting to all of these things. He's not saying he's a monster. It's not established fact. And eventually he went back to Spain. Isabel, who didn't hate and want to exploit the Indians here, she actually wanted to spread Christianity or Catholicism. She recalled Christopher Columbus based on these accusations. She tried him, but after the trial, she found him innocent and she let him go. But the point is if she didn't care about the Native Americans, if she was just there for money and greed and whatever, why would she even recall him? She recalled him because she did care. She wanted to spread Christianity through the New World. She thought this was like a godsend. She wasn't there just for the gold. She was like, God has blessed me with this opportunity to spread Christianity through the New World. And guess what? She did. And today, until the capitalists and communists overthrew all of South America, it was mostly a Christian continent for a long time. They went from the Aztecs worshiping a sun god and cutting the beating hearts out of children to worshiping Jesus Christ. So it's an incredible story. Was Christopher Columbus good or bad? He's probably a little bit of both. I'm not going to make that determination. I'm only going to tell you what he did do. Yes, he was involved in some of the slave trade, but he also advocated for the Indians. A lot of the Indians loved him, and a lot of these settlers felt like he was biased in their favor. He was favoring the Indians. So it's not this black and white narrative that leftists are pushing. I'm not going to pick a side. I'm not going to make Christopher Columbus a saint. I'm not going to make him the devil. I'm only going to tell you what we know. And then this leads to the last point, and that is it's okay to be undecided. Sometimes we think we have to hash it out, and we have to, and then once we decide this is our team, I believe in Columbus, that's our team, and we have to continue to perpetuate that narrative. I don't care. We have some historical facts. I'm going to present those, and I don't know if he is the monster described in those letters. Then yeah, he's a bad man. But we owe him the benefit of the doubt, and the truth is I just don't know. I don't want to acquit him. But I would say he's probably innocent until proven guilty. And I've read it. I've studied it. I can't say that he's guilty. The Queen certainly investigated it. She found him innocent in that time. How can I go back into that time and reinvestigate things and condemn him now? Because they had more facts back then. They were closer to the situation then. Another thing, I was watching Adam Knows Everything. Don't ever watch him. He's such a liar. He's so bad. And he was talking about how Columbus came and wiped out this India tribe. Well, some of them actually did have a sickness like we're having with Corona. Would we say that the Chinese are horrible because of the coronavirus? Maybe the government, I don't know. But the point is like the average Chinese citizens coming over here, they weren't trying to eradicate us with the coronavirus. They brought it over unknowingly. That's wrong to condemn the Europeans for that. They didn't bring the diseases over to kill them. But the other thing was this tribe was eradicated because one was partly from disease. But the other was marriage. They had all these men coming over, and they were intermarrying between the two. And so eventually, not that they hated them, were trying to wipe them out. They married them, made children with them, and then they became the Latinos. So a mixture of the Indians and the Spanish, the Latinos and Latinas. So they didn't eradicate them because they hated them. They intermarried with them, and the tribe kind of got broken up over time because they became part of the European society. They weren't hateful, racist. They were Christians. And I hate how the left goes back and tries to demonize everything. So anyway, I've gone too far. I probably rambled. I want you to know two things. I want you to know that at Blue Manor Academy, we're going to do our best to present a true history, not a Protestant history, a conservative history, a liberal history, just facts, just truth. That is it. If I say something on there and you can correct me, thank God. I have no bias. I only have a bias for the truth. So if I've said something wrong, correct me. Change my narrative. My narrative changed a lot over the years based on the facts. So I'm not biased or closed-minded. I'm open to the truth wherever it leads. And that's, if we want to give our kids a great education, that's what we have to do. We have to trust that the truth is strong enough, that it will sustain them. I'm not afraid of people presenting different religious views to my kids. We can look at that, and then if I've given them the tools to dissect and to research things, I'm not worried about the influence and being pulled or misled by people, because they'll be able to determine fact on their own. They can think for themselves. That's what we want. You can present your narrative of Christopher Columbus and he's a monster to my kids. My kids say, okay, cool. You got that from somewhere? Where did you get that from? Well, let me read. What did he say? And they're going to know how to dissect and find the truth. See how important that is? I'm not afraid of of a different Protestant denomination, or even a Muslim or something like that, coming over and evangelizing to my kids, maybe my young ones, they're not ready, but the point is our kids are going to go out into the real world. They're going to be presented with different biases. It's more important that we not keep all of that away from them, but we give them the tools to dissect and find the truth. So there you go. That wasn't a question. These are supposed to be question days, by the way, but it was kind of related to a question that I got privately in an email from someone, so that's why I'm addressing it. Next Wednesday, we're going to do another topic. We'll try to keep doing questions on Friday. I know these can end up being long speeches. If you want to know more, read Revealing School. This is a great book. The other book is Education. You can get them both on Amazon. The next book is coming out. I worked on it last night some more. It's halfway done editing. It's character. It's phenomenal. Probably my favorite, probably the most powerful one is the fourth book that's coming. And then the last book is going to be The Triumph of Evil, The Enemies of Greatness. I haven't decided if I'm going to call it Enemies of the Triumph of Evil yet, but that I'm going to bust Disney open. I'm going to expose who these people are in Hollywood. And because our kids have to know where the enemy is too. They have to know who these people are, what their agenda is, what is going on in the world. How did we become founded as a Christian nation and just get annihilated, just get decimated? Like we can't even, we're just losing wave and wave of Christians. This didn't just happen. Like, where did this come from? You study true history, it's clear as day. If you study the fake narrative, it's so confusing. You say, how is this happening? Where is this coming from? So that last book is going to be important because it's going to show your kid the enemy. It's just going to reveal it. And they're going to know where the enemy is. They can protect themselves, and they're going to do battle, hopefully, for the church, for our Christian faith. So that's my goal. All right, guys. Done rambling. Thank you guys so much. I will talk to you again soon. Thank you guys for signing up. The price is actually, we updated the site. It went up a few bucks. It's $3 extra. It helps us fund the site. It helps us put more content there. We're not making any money from it. We're just putting it back. Great content for your kids. Hope they love it. I hope you find it as a good investment. Probably not as polished as other sites yet. It's going to be there. And I can at least say that we're trying to be honest. And we're trying to give your kids the best education possible. I can't say that for other sites. Some of them it's more important about the marketing, or anyway, they have their own agenda, I would say too. So, all right, I'm done. No more rambling. Thank you guys. Talk to you later.